There's a certain kind of pain that doesn't scream, it doesn't shout, it doesn't even ask for help. It just sits inside you, like a silent ache behind the ribs, pressing deeper every time you try to breathe normally. It disguises itself in sighs, in long pauses. In those moments, you suddenly go quiet, mid-conversation, and no one notices, because the truth is, you're carrying something that even you can't explain anymore. It's not sadness, it's not fear, it's not depression exactly. It's something older, deeper, heavier, something sacred. It's called groaning, and maybe no one ever told you this, but what you're feeling right now, that silent, soul-level anguish that wakes you in the middle of the night, it's not a sign of failure. It's not weakness. It's not evidence that your faith is broken. It's actually a language that heaven recognizes. The Bible says in Romans 8:26 that the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. That means when your prayers die on your tongue, when you open your mouth and all that comes out is a broken exhale, when your thoughts are so disorganized that even trying to talk to God feels exhausting, the Spirit is still speaking, through you, for you, with you. That deep ache in your chest, that moment when you're sitting in your car, staring into nothing, unable to even say, "God, help me," that's not the absence of spiritual power. That's evidence of spiritual connection. Heaven isn't ignoring you. Heaven is responding to you with its own kind of groaning. There's something holy about silence, something divine about the soundlessness of pain that no one else hears. Because in that stillness, in that aching void, something begins to shift. You were never meant to walk around with that weight forever, but you were meant to feel it, because sensitivity in the Spirit comes with a cost. The cost is that you'll cry over things no one else sees. You'll carry burdens for people who don't even know they're being carried. You'll wake up with an ache for a world that seems to be getting colder by the hour, and no one will understand. They'll say you're too emotional, that you care too much, that you need to lighten up. But you weren't made for numbness. You were made to feel heaven groaning through you. Some of the most spiritually gifted people in the world walk around looking like they're barely holding it together. And you want to know why? Because they're not just living their lives, they're interceding, carrying the weight of unseen things, trembling under the pressure of destinies not yet born. And here's where the lie comes in. The enemy wants you to believe that your pain is a problem, that your anguish means you're off track, that you're broken beyond repair. But in reality, the weight you're feeling is a signal, a divine pulse, echoing through your soul saying, "You're aligned, you're sensitive, you're closer than ever." It's what happens when your heart becomes too full of eternity to be satisfied with the temporary, when your spirit starts remembering something your mind forgot, when the veil thins and heaven presses closer. Your flesh feels it as pressure, but your soul knows its proximity. Proximity to glory, proximity to breakthrough, proximity to God. Let's be honest, you don't just want answers. You want relief. You want to be held. You want to know you're not going crazy. You want to be told that this pain means something. So let me tell you now, it does. Every groan is a thread being pulled from eternity into time. Every ache is a signal flare from your soul, reaching toward a reality deeper than language. Every tear that falls when no one's watching is a testimony written in invisible ink, one that God reads before you even know how to explain it. You are not failing. You are feeling. And that feeling, as unbearable as it seems, is sacred. Because there are moments when language fails, when theology sounds like noise, when the most powerful thing you can do is just be still and let your spirit speak in groan. You don't need to have the right words. You don't need to understand why it hurts this much. You just need to know this. The Spirit is groaning with you, not above you, not watching from a distance, with you. The God who created galaxies also understands wordless pain. He recognizes the trembling in your chest. He sees the flinch in your eyes when people ask if you're okay. And He doesn't need an explanation. He never did. He just needs your honesty. So maybe tonight, instead of praying with your mind, you let your soul speak. You lay there and groan, you exhale the ache, you say nothing, and let everything rise in silence. And in that moment, heaven leans in. Because in a world that rewards noise, distraction, and shallow optimism, you've chosen something ancient. You've chosen the language of groaning, the raw, sacred, unfiltered cry of a spirit that still dares to believe in something greater. That is not weakness. That is not failure. That is intimacy, and it's closer to heaven than you've ever been. There's something no one warns you of when you start walking with God more deeply. The closer you get to the light, the more clearly you see what's still dark inside you. Not just sin, but sadness. Not just weakness, but wounds you didn't even know you still carried. You think you're falling apart, when in reality, the Spirit is opening you up to see what He's been healing quietly for years. There's a moment in almost every believer's life where everything becomes too much. The weight of existence, the noise of the world, the silence of unanswered prayers, the ache of memories you thought you buried years ago, suddenly rising to the surface without invitation. You feel raw, irritable, confused, tired, not just in your body but in your soul. And yet, for some reason, you're still here, still praying, even if your prayers feel empty, still hoping, even if that hope feels more like a whisper than a roar. Still showing up, not because you're strong, but because something in you refuses to quit. That something is sensitivity. What you're calling weakness is actually evidence that your spirit hasn't hardened like the rest of the world. You're still tender, still open, still reachable. You cry during worship not because you're unstable, but because heaven is closer than your skin, and your body doesn't know how else to respond. That level of vulnerability isn't a liability. It's proof that the fire hasn't gone out. And yes, it hurts. Because spiritual sensitivity feels like exposure, like your nerves are sitting just under the surface of everything. You can't laugh things off like others do. You can't pretend not to care. You feel when things are wrong, even if you can't explain why. You walk into rooms and feel the atmosphere shift, and suddenly you're overwhelmed for no obvious reason. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You're spiritually awake. Most people aren't. They've gone numb just to survive. Numb to God. Numb to their own heart. Numb to the suffering of others. But not you. And that's why the anguish you feel is not a curse. It's a consecration. You are tuned into something eternal. Your spirit is picking up on divine frequency. And sometimes, the burden of that sensitivity breaks you in ways that make no sense to the rational mind. But God never asked you to be rational. He asked you to be available. And available hearts are often broken ones, because only broken hearts can carry the oil of true compassion. There's a reason Scripture says Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. The Son of God, perfect in holiness, wept. He wept over people, over cities, over death, over unbelief. And his tears weren't weakness. They were prophecy. They were healing. They were a declaration that divinity isn't emotionless. It's intimately involved. So why do you feel like falling apart lately? Because maybe your spirit is being stretched. Maybe your soul is expanding to hold something it couldn't contain before. Maybe you've outgrown your old emotional shell. Maybe the pain is not a sign of regression, but a preparation for glory. There's a mystery in Romans 8:22 that most people overlook. Paul writes that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. That includes you. Your soul is in labor. But labor doesn't look holy. It looks like sweat, like screaming, like shaking hands gripping onto something invisible, trying to survive the transition between now and not yet. And here's the thing about spiritual labor. It doesn't come with instructions. You don't always know what's being born. You don't get a name or a due date. You just feel the pressure, the stretching, the emptiness between contractions, the fear that you're not going to survive this wave. But you do, because groaning always precedes glory. And if your soul is groaning right now, It means you're closer to revelation than you think. That aching? It's not madness. It's not weakness. It's a response to something eternal breaking into the temporary. And that's why you've felt out of place lately. Like you don't belong here. Like nothing satisfies. Like even when good things happen, there's still this ache, this restless, this sacred discontent. You weren't made to be fully comfortable here. You're homesick for heaven. And your spirit knows it. But instead of seeing that ache as failure, what if you saw it as confirmation? What if the pain is actually a signal that you're finally aligned, that you're awake, that you're hearing something the world can't hear? You're not depressed. You're being drawn. And the longer you stay in this world, the louder that pull becomes, not to die, but to live differently, to love deeper, to feel fully, to carry the weight of heaven into places that forgot what holiness sounds like. So don't shut it down. Don't numb it. Don't explain it away. Let the ache live. Let it grow. Let it shape you. Because what's coming is not going to be born through perfect people with polished prayers. It's going to be born through the anguished, the cracked, the groaning ones who refuse to stop believing even when it broke them open. It's terrifying when heaven goes quiet. Not because we stopped believing in God, but because we don't know how to keep going without hearing Him. That silence becomes the loudest thing in the room, and we start to wonder if maybe something's wrong with us, if maybe our prayers got lost somewhere, if maybe we missed something, and now we're being punished. But what if I told you that silence isn't rejection, it's refinement? Sometimes God doesn't speak because He's doing something deeper than your ears can handle. He's speaking in the language of pressure, in tension, in delay, in what feels like absence but is actually presence without performance. And when that happens, everything inside of you wants to escape it. You start second-guessing yourself. You replay your choices. You question your discernment. You go back to your old habits just to feel something again. Because the new place God is taking you into doesn't come with the comfort you used to cling to. You're not being ignored. You're being invited into a dimension of relationship where feeling God is replaced by trusting Him. And that trust doesn't come dressed in lightning bolts and angelic visitation. It comes wrapped in uncertainty, in silence, in waiting room. And there's something sacred about that waiting, because only in the waiting do you discover what's really anchoring you. Was it the goosebumps, the answered prayers, the emotional high from your last spiritual breakthrough? Or was it something deeper, something stronger, like covenant? God never promised you comfort. He promised you closeness. And closeness doesn't always come in the form of miracles. Sometimes it comes in the form of groans too deep for words. You know why Romans 8:26 says the Spirit intercedes with groans? Because when you can't speak, God still moves. When you can't pray, God still listens. And when you're too tired to explain what's wrong, He already knows. Some of the most powerful moments in your spiritual life will feel like abandonment, but they're actually the birthplaces of authority, because anyone can praise when they feel God. But it takes real maturity to praise when you don't. It's not that God left you, it's that He trusts you enough to keep walking, even when you can't hear His footsteps anymore. Think of Joseph, betrayed, sold, imprisoned, forgotten. For years, God didn't say a word. No dreams, no interventions, no angelic reminders, just darkness, silence, repetition. But all the while, something was growing inside him, a deeper clarity, a sacred steadiness, a kind of spiritual durability that couldn't be shaken when promotion finally came. The waiting didn't break him, it built him. And maybe, just maybe, your groaning isn't about what's missing, but about what's being formed. You're not being punished, you're being prepared. And preparation often looks like failure to the untrained eye. It looks like unanswered prayers, lost connections, dried up wells, and nights where you stare at the ceiling wondering if you're still on the right path. But what if all of that is part of God's way of severing you from false sources? What if He's letting things go silent so that you finally stop searching for signs and start trusting His voice, even when it's still? The groaning is sacred. It's your soul unlearning the rhythm of this world so it can move in time with eternity. It's your spirit shedding layers of performance and stepping into naked, unfiltered faith. And that kind of faith is what scares hell the most. Because once you stop depending on how things feel and start walking by what you know, you become unshakable. You become a threat. You become a vessel that hell can't intimidate anymore. That's why the warfare has increased. That's why you feel exhausted without explanation. That's why your emotions have been all over the place. That's why the things that used to fulfill you now feel empty. It's not regression, it's redefinition. You are being redefined from the inside out. And the groaning is part of that process. You don't need to panic. You don't need to fix it. You don't need to explain it to anyone. You just need to stay. Stay in the ache. Stay in the silence. Stay in the tension between who you were and who you're becoming. Because in that place, that sacred in-between, something eternal is being whispered through your weakness. You may not hear it, you may not feel it, but it's real. Heaven is closer than your next breath, and it knows exactly what's being born inside you. Some days, the weight comes out of nowhere. You wake up with a heaviness you can't name. You feel tired before you even move. There's no dramatic crisis, no clear reason, just a deep, invisible pressure that sits on your chest and clouds your thoughts. And in that moment, you don't feel holy, you don't feel strong, you don't feel chosen, you just feel off. But what if that heaviness isn't yours? What if it's warfare, disguised as weariness? Spiritual battles don't always feel like thunder or terror. Sometimes they feel like fog, confusion, apathy, random sadness, unexplained agitation. You think you're just off, when in truth, you're under attack. Because the enemy isn't interested in stealing your money or your car. He wants your clarity. He wants your joy. He wants the peace that anchors your soul in the unseen realm. And the best way to steal those things isn't through dramatic events. It's through subtle erosion. He drains you slowly, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, until one day you start doubting things you were once sure of. You start feeling numb in worship. You start isolating, even though you crave connection. You stop praying, not because you don't believe, but because you don't have the words anymore. And that's exactly what hell wants. Because a silent believer is a vulnerable one. An exhausted believer is an easier target, and a discouraged believer won't fight back. But what if I told you that your fatigue is actually a confirmation, not of defeat, but of value? You don't get attacked for being irrelevant. You get attacked for carrying something that scares the darkness, that unexplained pressure, that emotional drop-off, that recurring anxiety. It might not be depression. It might not be your hormones. It might not be your fault. It might be because you are being opposed. The enemy sees what you can't. He sees the impact of your voice. He sees the authority you're stepping into. He sees the ripple effect of your obedience. And if he can't stop God's promises over your life, he'll try to make you stop believing in them. He'll whisper lies that sound like your own thoughts. You're too tired for this. Maybe you made all this up. No one cares what you're carrying. God doesn't talk to people like you. And when you agree with those lies, even subtly, the enemy gains ground without ever lifting a sword. But the truth is, you were never meant to fight this battle alone. You were never called to muscle through on your own strength. That's why Romans 8:26 says the Spirit helps us in our weakness, not after it, but in it. He groans with us. He fights through us, not by making us superheroes, but by making us vessels. Your weakness is not a disqualification. It's an invitation. It invites the power of God to take over. It invites the angels to surround you. It invites heaven's strategy to be revealed, if you don't quit too early. The war for your soul is subtle, yes, but it's real. And the moment you stop treating your emotions as random and start discerning them spiritually, you begin to take your authority back. You begin to pray differently. You begin to worship more honestly. You stop apologizing for being sensitive and you start wielding it as a weapon. You begin to realize that your tears are not signs of weakness, but swords soaked in truth. That your restlessness is not a flaw, but a signal that your spirit refuses to settle in a world it doesn't belong to. That your heaviness is not depression, it's discernment. You're picking up on atmospheres. You're feeling what others refuse to feel. You're standing in the gap without even realizing, and yes, it's exhausting, but it's also holy. Because what if your groaning is actually intercession? What if your battle is delivering someone else's breakthrough? What if the reason you feel under pressure is because your obedience is breaking chains you can't even see? The enemy knows what your freedom would do to others. He knows the sound of your praise on the other side of pain. He knows the fire that would be released if you stopped doubting and started declaring. So, he fights you here, in the shadows, in the fog, in the feelings that don't make sense. But don't let that fog fool you. Your life is not small. Your calling is not forgotten. Your weakness is not the end of the story. You are not lost. You are not behind. You are in transition. You are in the middle of a silent war, not because you're dying, but because you're carrying something worth protecting. And if you could see what was happening in the invisible realm, the angels moving, the demons retreating, the prayers shaking things you'll never understand this side of eternity, you'd stop doubting your strength and start realizing just how fiercely God is defending you. You didn't break, even with the silence, even with the confusion, even with the weight no one could see. You didn't quit, and that matters more than you realize. Because there is a moment in every spiritual journey where survival itself is the greatest form of resistance, where the enemy doesn't need you to sin, he just needs you to stop. Stop hoping, stop expecting, stop showing up. If he can't destroy your life, he'll try to dull your vision until you quietly hand it over yourself. But you didn't, and that's why you're still here, still breathing, still searching, still clinging to something deeper than emotion, something holy. Because deep down, even in your weakest hour, something inside you refused to die. And that's not just resilience, that's prophecy. That's the echo of God's voice still moving through you, even when you thought you couldn't hear it. It's the Spirit groaning inside you for a reality your eyes have never seen. And now, after all the breaking, groaning, doubting, and enduring, something is about to shift. Because pain in the kingdom is never wasted. It's always a process, always a womb, always a space between who you were and who you're becoming. And that pressure you've been feeling? That wasn't punishment, it was contraction. The Spirit in you was pushing against every false identity, every dead weight, every narrative you agreed with that didn't come from God. And in that tension, the spiritual labor began. You weren't being broken, you were being opened to see differently, opened to speak with clarity, open to walk with a weight of authority no one can take from you. Because when you've suffered and still refuse to let go of your faith, you carry something far more valuable than comfort. You carry oil. And oil only comes one way: crushing. You want power? You want authority? You want the kind of faith that makes demons nervous? Then you have to walk through what others run from. You have to learn how to cry and fight at the same time. You have to worship while bleeding. You have to trust God with your silence and still believe He's good when your prayers return with no sound. You don't need to feel strong to be strong. You don't need a platform to carry presence. You don't need applause to know you're anointed. What you went through didn't weaken you. It marked you. And there's a difference between someone who's been taught and someone who's been formed. Taught faith recites verses. Formed faith becomes them. Taught faith waits for light. Formed faith learns to burn in the dark. Taught faith pleads for a breakthrough. Formed faith walks as the breakthrough. That's who you are now. Not because you always got it right, but because you stayed. You stayed in the ache. You stayed when it didn't make sense. You stayed when you had every reason to walk away. And heaven took notice. You may have felt invisible, but there's not a tear you cried that didn't move angel. Every time you prayed when you were exhausted, every time you forgave when you had every right to hate, every time you chose to believe when your soul screamed otherwise, heaven recorded it. And now, something is opening. Not in the realm of emotion, but in the realm of assignment. You're not just surviving anymore. You're birthing something, a new clarity, a new boldness, a fire that refuses to be put out. Because the groaning wasn't your end, it was your signal. You're stepping into the very thing the enemy tried to keep you from. And the reason the pressure was so intense, the reason the warfare was so personal, the reason the silence felt like abandonment, was because your voice carries weight. You don't just speak encouragement, you carry deliverance. You don't just post verses, you release breakthrough. You don't just pray nice prayers, you stir atmospheres. And that's why you've been fought. But the fight is shifting now. Because once you see the pattern, the power returns. Once you realize the enemy's playbook, you stop playing defense. You stop apologizing for your sensitivity. You stop shrinking to be accepted. You stop confusing spiritual discernment for depression. And you stand, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who's been through the fire and came out carrying oil. So breathe. You made it. Not because you're perfect, but because you're pregnant with something holy. And when heaven plants something inside you, hell can try to delay it, but it can't stop the delivery. You don't need to force it. You don't need to explain it. You just need to carry it well and let it come when it's time. The contractions were real. The groaning was necessary. The pressure was holy. And now, after all that, you are ready. You are not the same. You are not small. You are not forgotten. You are chosen. You are marked. And you are rising. Not as the person who was crushed, but as the vessel that refused to be emptied. You're not at the end. You're at the beginning. And what's coming next will silence every lie that tried to make you believe otherwise.